I actually thought the good thing, despite the lack of a British presence, which you were talking about before the hour started, was that the Americans were there. I think, you know, in the last 4 years, one has a sense that President Trump has, you know, wanted to really wind up NATO and the security and see Europe standing more on its own 2 feet. So I think if I took it that the fact that the Americans were there was actually still, and in such a presence, was actually good news that they're still taking Europe seriously. Although, to answer your question, I do think it's interesting. Over the weekend, we read about more tension over Nord Stream 2, which is clearly a German-Russian axis. And I think part of the difficulty for, I would say, the Americans and what's happening in Europe is there seems to be continuing political disintegration at the moment. You know, the Germans are clearly now leaderless. There's friction, as you were pointing out earlier, between France and Germany about the speed of integration in Europe and things. And we know that Spain, Italy, and a few of the other countries have barely got a government at this moment in time. So I think it's quite hard to get a lot of traction. But I think Europe progressively is getting the message they're going to have to stand on their own 2 feet. And therefore, I think that is a good thing that is coming out of this, and should give, even with the UK inside Europe, I think us more self-confidence as we look into the future.
As you look at the way markets are behaving, well, equity markets, let's be very specific here. Equity markets are behaving around these issues, the sort of grumpiness on the international relations front, and then coronavirus, and then the rather mixed corporate earnings season that we had out of the fourth quarter. You'd be forgiven for thinking that actually things are generally okay. And if we think that equities are doing their job appropriately as being a discounting mechanism for risk and future economic activity, everything's going to be fine for the rest of 2020, or are they complacent?
Well, I think there's 2 things. I think the underlying dynamics of some of the leadership of the markets, we know that despite Boeing's difficulties, defense stocks have been doing relatively well, which I think picks up on your theme of maybe you know, we know at the margin governments are going to be upping their security spending and things along those lines to reflect some of the pressures from the US. But I think ultimately a lot of the sentiment for the equity markets comes out of the US. And I think there's clear bifurcation between a very dull US economy and now significant concerns over the health of China and Asia for the current quarter, if not maybe the first half of this year, and the fuel that is being poured into the markets courtesy of the Federal Reserve's QE. So I think the markets have to some extent bifurcated from the underlying fundamentals. And, you know, I know, because I watch a lot of your programs more in the evening when I'm back at my home, you know, there's, even in the US, there's this dissonance for me between expectations now of 8 to 10% earnings growth and maybe another re-rating of the US market, when last year saw better economic growth and no earnings growth. So to suddenly think you're going to get another 20% return on the back of the 30% you got last year, I find that logically highly unlikely. And so therefore I do think there's rising complacency. And the last thing I would say is, when you look at the leadership in the US, the FANGs are up 20%, the S&P's up 4%. So it means the rest of the market's down. And I think that's possibly the message, that we need to look outside the comfort blanket of some of the big stocks to look at the message coming from the real world. And as you know, to pick up on your point on the coronavirus, oil is telling you the world has stopped. You know, we have seen oil collapse 20% this year, and that's not a sign of particular optimism for the second half of the year as far as I can see.
Hi, I'm Joanna Bersecci, and thank you for watching. You can check out more of our videos by clicking on the boxes on the screen. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more from CNBC International. Thank you for watching.